SPE people, welcome back to the SCOPO Series, Future Roles of Oil and Gas. I'm 𝘰𝘰𝘮𝘰𝘮𝘰, the host of this podcast. Today, we want to talk about the acceptance of oil and gas replacement in tomorrow's world. We will be discussing this topic with the Asia Technology Lead at the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, who serves as an energy economics and policy advisor. Additionally, he held the position of chairman at 𝘤𝘤𝘬𝘳𝘰𝘮𝘰 Central and East Indonesia from 2018 to 2019. Please welcome our special guest, Mas Putra Adhiguna.
Hello Najwa, thank you for having me.
Hello Mas. How's your day, Mas Putra?
Doing good, thank you. I hope you're doing well too.
Yes, I'm nothing better than today. Thank you so much for your time and your willingness to share your knowledge, Mas.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for the invitation from you and team.
You're welcome. Okay, Mas. As we know, Mas Putra is an Asia Technology Lead. But could you tell us a little about your current position? Actually, what is Asia Technology Lead?
So basically, I guess I would start with IEEFA. IEEFA is the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. We are an independent think tank. We're a non-profit body. What we do is really discussing and evaluating the various energy transition in various countries and various markets. Now, as the Asia Technology Lead, what I do is a combination of evaluating emerging technologies, looking at different countries in Asia, including Indonesia, to see what's happening, across all energy sector. We're talking the oil, gas, coal, renewables, and see how the progress through energy transition goes. So that's the long story short.
What specifically fuels your interest in the energy transition, or what makes you interested in this industry?
I think the world is in a changing position. As we all know, that there is a big concerns about the changing climate. There's a climate crisis that is ongoing, and this introduced a lot of changes, both within the energy sectors and also outside of the energy sectors. Now, within the energy sectors, there will be a lot of questions. So what made me interested about evaluating the energy transition is that so many things are changing. We're talking about the behavior of people, the behavior of government, corporations, investors, and everything. So all of these are happening at the same time. So it's going to be important for countries like Indonesia to understand where it needs to go and how it needs to go through the energy transition. So that really what started my interest in evaluating all these questions.
But as long as your career path, you must have struggled in this industry. What the most challenging you have faced in this industry, Mas?
So let me begin with, I spent about 13 to 15 years in the oil, gas, and geothermal sector,
yes.
So across many different fields of operations and career. But coming back to the energy transition question, I think the biggest challenge that I face is trying to understand what is really going on, what is happening in the world, what is happening in each sector, and what is happening within each market. Because I think understanding this question is critical to see where countries like Indonesia will go to the future. The complication is that, and I'm sure Najwa also see this situation in other places, when you open the news, you open the newspaper, you will see this minister say we will go to A direction, and then you open the TV and you'll see this minister say we're going to B direction. So if I were in your position, I would be confused.
Yes.
And to be honest, even multiple years after I'm trying to understand this, there's still a lot of room of ambiguity. So that I think is really the biggest challenge that I face, trying to figure out who's really saying the truth, who's really saying the ambitions, and how do we inform the public. The public can be many people, right? It can be the corporations, it can be the government, it can be the young generations like you do. Because I think the biggest risk that we're facing is that if countries like us cannot communicate clearly to the young generations where we need to go and how we need to go through it. So that's really the biggest challenge that I think that faced me.
Oh, so the biggest challenges is you try to find the right way, who's the truth, the government or the other side, like that.
Yes, so I think at this moment, when we talk about energy transition, nobody understands everything.
Yeah.
So it's like the whole world is still trying to figure out what's going to happen. So that's why, and this is not just about Indonesia. So if you ask a person from an industry A, whatever that industry may be, it can be the wind industry, they can give you a different picture from a person from industry B, from the gas industry. And really what's happening right now is that everybody's competing. They're competing for attention, they're competing for credibility, and they're competing mostly for financing and investment. So within this world, I don't think anybody got it all figured out. So I think, that's still going, and this is not just Indonesia, by the way. So this is happening all across the world. So people even in Europe today, in the United States, and many other places, they're still trying to figure out what each country will do within the energy transition.
You have petroleum background before you enter this energy transition industry. Could you tell us a little about your background?
So I spent the first few years of my career as a field engineer. I'm working for one of the oil field service companies, working across many different places. And then I progressed through my career through various positions. It includes many things, from field operations positions, quality management, and all kinds of career progress, I would say. And it was quite interesting because I think it's important for anybody who is working anywhere they are, trying to learn as much as they can in their career. There is a tendency for us that once we enter a bucket, what I mean is by bucket, for example, I'm becoming a production engineer. And throughout my lifetime, that's all I'm going to learn. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's really, there's this discussion about people can be a generalist, a specialist, and each has a different predisposition, so to say. I'm one of those people who like to learn general things, so I tend to explore many other things. So I spent, I think, about 3 to 4 years in the geothermal sector as well, also trying to figure out what's going on. So that was the history of my career progress in the oil sector.
What about oil and gas energy opportunities in the future? Will it really be replaced?
It will take a very long time to replace the oil and gas. But what is important is for us to understand a few dynamics that's happening. Let's take a few steps back and look at history. From the first time that the oil is being produced in the Drake well in Pennsylvania up until today, the oil sector has been growing and growing and growing.
Yes.
So throughout 100-year history, the oil sector, all it sees is a climbing scale. Now, the changing dynamics is that there are two things that are important to notice. The first one is that there is the global climate crisis that is pushing people to basically say, wait a minute, we can't emit too much CO2 into the environment because it's causing a lot of issues. So what comes with that is that there's the push to reach what we call the peak fossil fuel demand. Now, when this happens, the climbing curve will slowly slow down, right? It will not go dipping like this, so it'll probably going to take a long time to plateau, basically going flat, before eventually it going to go down. What is the primary mechanism? It varies. For those of you who are familiar with the oil sector, for example, the primary demand is coming from the transportations. Road transport accounts for a big portion of the oil demand. So with the introduction of various technologies, we're talking about battery, electric vehicles, hybrids, and so forth, what will probably happen is that the oil demand will be replaced by electricity demand. Now, this is a statistics that many people don't pay attention. The sales of conventional passenger cars have peaked in 2017. That was 6 years ago. So the global sales of our conventional gasoline or diesel vehicles in passenger side has peaked quite a while ago. And a lot of this shift is happening because of the electrification of the transport sector. Now, coming back to the oil upstream sector, what will happen is that in the past, usually, if you're asking an expert, they will say, oil demand will grow by X% for the next 20 years. That forecast is now going to change. Now, the complication is that as it goes from this mode into this mode, there will be a lot of questions about prioritization of investments. So countries and corporations will compete in getting what we call the cheapest barrel to produce, right? And each country have their own different advantage. You know, when we, initially, for example, if you have an oil field anywhere in Indonesia, you can say, oh, it's okay, we will produce it, somebody will buy it. But then maybe you can convince people back then. But now, if you're trying to say that, people will ask you again, wait a minute, we're seeing a peak demand coming soon. Are you sure you can still sell your oil within the next 20 years? And if not, what are your other options? So I think this is very important. So when we talk about oil sector, we're seeing that period going from the climbing mode to the plateau before it probably eventually going to start to decline. One thing to remember is that globally, the world oil production is at about 100 million barrels. That's a lot of barrel per day. So it's not going to change overnight. It will take a long time to displace the oil from the various sectors. An average lifetime of a car, for example, is anywhere between 12 to 18 years. So once today you're introducing a new gasoline-powered car, it'll take them another 12 to 18 years before it's retired. So there's going to be a long changes and transition away from oil. Now, the same dynamics is happening in gas, but gas is a bit different. The reason being is that gas is mostly used in the power and the industrial sector. So there is this narrative that say basically, coal is too dirty. We need to change to something cleaner. And gas presents itself as an option. But keeping in mind two things. Number one is that there is what is called the methane emissions. So for those of you who's familiar, in climate sector, we like to say CO2 emissions. But in reality, there is a different factor that is called the methane emissions that can do much more damage than CO2. So the gas sector will need to be responsible in making sure as minimum as possible of methane leaks. Methane leaks can happen during drilling process, production process, pipeline, LNG, and so forth. So there's this dynamics as well. So coming back to the big questions, I think it'll take such a long time, but this will eventually, my guess, the global policy will continue to intensify in pushing for a peak fossil fuel demand. So how fast will we see it? We don't know. So there's multiple transitions that is ongoing. Obviously, if you're in the UK, you would be different from those in the US and from those in Indonesia and Japan. So each countries are running in different paths. So it'll take some time. So there's going to be quite some time. So if we look at the years, and, people are saying net zero target by 2050, 2060. Different countries say different things. But it's going to be a complicated journey.
Regarding to the air quality and the temperature that getting hotter by now, what are the strategies that the government, the private sector, and even us as a society need to do to accelerate the adoption of new renewable energy? On the other side, the fossil energy is still needed.
So the dynamics, that's a very good question, Najwa, because I don't think anybody have an answer to that tough questions. Let's talk about air quality and temperature. The world is facing a different period, right? I mean, like literally every 2 weeks when we open the news, there is a fire in Canada, and then there's going to be a massive fire in Australia, and it's going to be a flooding in Pakistan and so forth. So the implication of climate change is happening as we speak. So even today, people just say, "Oh, Jakarta is very hot," and people in Indonesia, in terms of awareness of climate, is still very low. And that's a challenge, if you're based yourself in more developed countries, they'll literally say, "Oh, this is climate crisis. Climate crisis makes the temperature hotter," and so forth. Although some people may not agree with that. But coming back to Indonesia, I'd like to ground this to Indonesia. In Indonesia, it's very difficult to talk about climate because people will say, "Oh, it's hot." Why it's hot? Well, just because it's hot, right? And I actually live in a village where all my neighbors are planting, vegetables. And all they say like, wow, this is very dry. So what's happening? So there is the big responsibility for us, the well-educated people, from all generations, including yourself, to educate the public about what's happening. Now, to the question about what can we do, at the end of the day, I think we need to look at it both strategically and pragmatically. Let me explain. So I think we need to be honest as a country to look into each sector and ask ourselves, are we doing the right thing in a transition period by doing this? So we cannot speak about energy transition without talking about fossil fuels. What tends to happen is that people talk about energy transitions and all they talk about are two things, renewables and coal. Now, let me tell you that in between there is oil and gas, which has a much bigger size and influence as well throughout the climate change. So when we talk about energy transition, I think it's important for us, the public, the academics, and also the country to look at each sector with a more realistic views. Let's look at Indonesia's oil. How much is the demand? How much is the supply? What's going to happen within the next 10, 20 to 40 years? Let's look at the gas. Let's look at the coal. Let's look at the renewables. And then we can kind of connect the dot to figure out what we're trying to do. Now, the dangers that I'm seeing in countries like Indonesia is that we're introducing a lot of artificial price control on many things. I'm not going to challenge the electricity and fuel subsidy. Let's set that aside for a moment, because I think there's a lot of people that still needs electricity subsidies and also the fuel subsidies. We're talking Pertalite and so forth. What I want to draw attention is that, for example, here's an example. Indonesia state utility company, PLN, says, we need to buy gas for our gas-fired power plant, but we can't afford it. Can the government give us cheaper? And then the government say, yes, you can have it cheaper. Now, Indonesia need to think very carefully how long of a gas reserve it has before it needs to start importing gas. Based on the latest calculation, that number is somewhere between 17 to 18 years. That's not a long time. So is it a good policy to start subsidizing gas price for PLN when we only have about 15 to 16 years before we need to import gas? So I think there's a lot of these questions out there. So I think as a nation, we need to be careful in imposing too many price controls of our resources, because the same thing is happening on many resources. Let me give you an example, biofuels. People will say, biofuels is good because it's produced domestically. I get it, it's a good point. It's less import. But what are the reasons that we're spending 50 trillion rupiah every year to subsidize biofuel adoption in Indonesia? Is it a good option? That's something that needs to be questioned, because with 50 trillion rupiah each year, you can create a lot of electric vehicles on the road, right? So this kind of yearly thinking of let's gather some 50 trillion each year and let's burn 50 trillion each year. This kind of mindset cannot go on forever, especially in the energy transition period, because I like to put it this way. If we look at energy transition as a whole, I'm moving a few steps from the oil and gas. I'm going to the coal sector. I like to say that in Indonesia's power sector, the past has ended, because if today you want to build a new coal power plants, you're not going to get the money. You're going to need a few $100 million from international banks, which nobody will fund, right? But the future hasn't started, because we haven't built a lot of new replacement capacity to replace all these coal plants that nobody wants to finance. So I think, coming back to the bigger questions, you're asking a complex question, so I'm trying to be as short as possible, but that's as easy as I can get, is that I think as a country, we need to be both pragmatic and strategic. We need to be careful in imposing price caps on everything, because that's not a policy. I like to say price caps is a wall. What we don't need a wall. What we need is bridge to the future, because the past has ended, but the future hasn't begun, and especially true for your generations.
What are the social economic impacts that we will face in our daily lives at the point that the energy transitions are bigger?
So the cost will be twofold. The cost of not doing anything and the cost of doing something. If collectively, as a global citizen, we're not doing anything to slow down the climate crisis, the cost is hard to be estimated. Some used to say the cost is 3% of global GDP, but now more recent estimates shows that it's much bigger than that. Now let me explain a little bit. How would you quantify the economic impact if all the forest and the palm plantation in Indonesia burnt down? It's very difficult. How would we quantify the effect of a climate crisis if suddenly the fishes die because the ocean heats up? So all these, there's a term that is called the amplifier. The climate crisis essentially is a threat amplifier, because what happens is that forest fire is a common occurrence. For the last hundreds of years, we always see, forest fire happening in Sumatra, forest fire happening in Kalimantan, and so forth. But combined with the climate crisis, this small risk will become much bigger. So the implications for the entire country will become multiplied. So I think that's what we need to understand, is that the climate crisis by nature is a threat amplifier. So what it does is that some things that used to happen, like for example flooding, I'm sure all of you in this room have encountered flooding in many versions, small or big, in Bekasi, in Bogor, in Jakarta. But couple that with the climate crisis and the flooding will become much worse. Couple that with a drought, people not getting water, and then the vegetable farmers cannot get their economic output. So estimates varies, and I'm not going to come up with numbers. I think you, as a young critical people, I think you can come up with various studies about the implications. So the implications for not doing anything is significant. But people will ask, so what should we do? So there are two answers to this. Number one is that if we look at it from a global emissions history perspective, there will be a demand from emerging societies to ask responsibilities from the West. You guys in England already industrialize and emit a lot of emissions. Can you help us to transition? And that is true. And this is what's happening globally. And to be honest, it hasn't been too much of a result, but this progress, I think, is going to happen anyway. So I think as Indonesia, I think we need to continue to push for assistance from many developed nations for the sole purpose of their historical responsibilities and emissions. Because for countries like us to invest a lot of money in, for example, power grid, renewables, electric vehicles, each of those cost money, and money that we may or may not have. Let's look at the APBN, the state budget, for example. Every year we spend about 500 or 600 trillion just to pay our debt, plus the interest of a few hundred trillion. So we don't have a lot of headroom. PLN's income today, last year, about 28% is from subsidy and compensation, which also tells you that PLN is basically not a sustainable business. The reason that they can still last is because the government continue to give them money year after year and after year. So in short, we don't have a lot of money, but let me try to push an example that if today Indonesia think that it's rich in resources, coal, palm oil, nickel, and everything else, then we need to be very strategic in how we use those resources and get some of those economic rents to be used for the future. I'm going to step aside and talk about the nickel sector so I can explain. People have been complaining, the nickel sector has a lot of biodiversity issues, there's a lot of coal plants and so forth. It's not environmentally friendly. So I do have a question for the government as well, because if Indonesia claim that it have a big resource of nickel, anything between 30 to 40% of reserves and productions by now, then where's the leverage? Why is it today we're still seeing environmental degradation from nickel production, right? I mean, these kind of things, I think, is the fine balancing that Indonesia will need. When we say we're rich on coal, okay, we can't stop other people from buying our coal, but what we can do is to save some money from that coal and help us to transition away. Because again, to be honest, we have limited fiscal capacity and also limited public capacity to fund everything. Let me stop there.
Okay, so if we choose to do something, the cost is still expensive, yeah, Mas?
Correct. So we need assistance from anywhere that we can do.
Okay, Mas. Here comes the final and the most anticipated question from the petroleum engineering students, Mas. As we know, oil and gas energy and renewable energy are two contradictory things. Are there opportunities for us as petroleum engineering graduates to have a career in the field of energy transition?
So let me begin with this. Petroleum engineers, by the last word of petroleum engineer is engineers, right? I mean, you are all well-educated part of the society. You know, the top 1%, the top 0.5% of the Indonesian society. Note that a lot of people in Indonesia only get to school to elementary level, you know, mid-junior level and high school level. So begin with that mindset, is that you are some of the best and the brightest that the nation have, both in terms of capacity and also in terms of opportunity. So with that in mind, I'd like to push your capability to be open-minded and to be flexible about the future. Because the worry that many of you are facing today is that, oh, the energy transition is here, oil and gas will not be needed. I already explained that it'll take a long time for oil and gas to be replaced, depending on what scenario we're going to go. But I think what's important is that many sectors are encountering changes as we speak. You know, if you study informatics, you know, within the last 12 months, there's a lot of development in AI. If you're studying finance, there's a lot of changes between the traditional banking sector and the fintech. So we can list all these changes. If you're studying mechanical engineering, hoping to work in a big auto company, you would be surprised to see that today there are 10 million battery electric vehicles on the road sale every single year. So this changes is happening everywhere as we speak. Some of those are driven by climate issues, but others are driven by just the usual world that is changing, technology changing, geopolitics are changing, you know, we're encountering wars after wars. So I think for the new generations, be flexible and be optimistic. I already explained oil and gas will take some time to be displaced. But what is important is that, especially during your college years, is to open up to as much information as you can. 15 years ago, we had a chat earlier before this, 15 or 20 years ago, if you want to find out what is the status of Indonesia's oil, gas or coal sector, it would be very difficult. You need to, you know, go to somebody that knows something, that has some slide or has some papers. Today, all you need to do is open up the search engine and type Indonesia's oil outlook, and you can find everything. So my message is that open up your views to those that are with you and against you. The reason I'm saying that is because it's very simple for us to be within a circle of people who are supportive of us, right? It's like, oh yeah, don't worry, everything will be okay. I'd like to challenge all of you guys as the new generation to both listen to those people, but at the same time, listen to the opposition voice. Because what will happen is that you will get a better sense of where the world is heading, where Indonesia is heading, and where you maybe need to heading. So again, I think there's still a long road for Indonesia's oil and gas, and people like to focus too much on the electric vehicles. You know, I tend to separate the issues of Indonesia oil into demand and supply. So be critical and looking at the demand, the electric vehicles, but also be critical when you look at the supply side. So you can compare easily. Today you can get a chart of Indonesia's oil and gas productions, and you can put an imagination of what's going to happen within the next 10 to 15 years. So be flexible. There's still going to be a long road ahead of us. Now, one last point is that be prepared to be deployed internationally. And I really mean this seriously. Now, for those of you who are in studying, make sure your English or whatever language that you want to pursue, whether it's Chinese, Arabic, Japanese, or whatever, you learn it strongly. Why am I saying this? Is because we talk about oil industry as if it's a single entity. It's not. Oil industry, there's the global trend, there's the regional trend, and then there's the in-country trends. So it can be very easy that you look at the news and say, oh, globally everything is okay. But it may or may not be true for Indonesia, and the vice versa. Maybe you're saying, oh, this trend will happen in Indonesia, but maybe it will not happen in Asia. So I think it's important for those two things. I come back. Number one is to be flexible. Number two is to open your eyes very widely with the information that you can, both from supporting and opposing voice. And number three, like the one I just mentioned, be careful, be well prepared for your future.
I have some additional question.
Sure.
Opportunities for conventional energy.
Extended with a hybrid?
Yes, with the electricity.
It depends who you ask. If you ask the Japanese automotive giants, they will say yes. If you ask the Chinese automotive giants, they will say no. So it depends on who you ask, because each countries have their own style of going the energy transition. I'm pulling you directly to industry example because today on the road, about 93% of all cars on the roads are Japanese branded. 99% of all the motorcycle on the road are Japanese branded. And the Japanese are not interested in going all electric so far. So it depends on who you ask. But there is a positive point about hybrid because it allows you to get more fuel efficiency because it still relies on gasoline and it becomes more efficient. Now, on that, I have to agree that there are places where it can be implemented. Now, one thing that we haven't discussed is that when you talk about energy, a key aspect is talk about efficiency. So a big question for countries like us is that how do we make our consumption of energy more efficient? Let me bring you one anecdote. In Indonesia, the fuel efficiency of passenger cars is 40% worse than that in India. This is a big question that we need to ask the government, the industries, and many people. Because this gives an example that once you make the fuel price low enough, like what we do with subsidies, nobody cares about anything, right? People like to ask me like, it's so easy, let's put a carbon tax. Yeah. I mean, nobody wants to put carbon tax because the government will change and there's going to be big demonstration and so forth. So to your question, yes, hybrid can be an option, provided that the hybrid car can be sold at an affordable price, right? Because right now what's happening is that the competition is really on technology and price. So really, right now, people will say, in Indonesia, all the battery electric vehicles are expensive. Now let me ask you this. How many battery electric vehicle car models are there in Indonesia? Probably 5. You don't know how much in the world there is? 200 to 300 models. So Indonesia is still at the very early stage of EV adoptions. Of course, if you have some money and say, I want to buy electric vehicles, there's only 5 models. It's like saying, I want to buy a cell phone, there's only 5 options, right? I mean, you're not interested. But if there's 100 options, people will have different options to go to. And also keep in mind, when we talk about oil, the motorcycle is one of the biggest consumer of oil in Indonesia. Per capita, Indonesia has more motorcycle than India. So that's a big industry. We're one of the biggest motorcycle industry in the world after China and India. So that's also important because people say, coming back to the question about hybrid, what are the options? So I don't believe that there's only one option. I believe that you can go hybrid, you can go there's a term called plug-in hybrid, where it's a hybrid cars with a battery. You can go full battery or you can go to other methods. So there are various options really that's out there.
Okay, Mas, can you give us a little speech for SPE people?
Thank you, Najwa, and thank you to all the listeners at home and in campus and wherever you are. Just a little speech, I guess. the last 20 years in the energy sector will not be the same as the next 20 years in the energy sector. So it's very easy that if you look outside, there are so many things that are changing every single year. So it is important, again, for the young generations to look very clearly on what's happening out there. Don't encircle yourself only on the people that agrees with your views, because it's going to narrow down your views about the world. The world is changing so rapidly, even it's so difficult for many industries to keep up. So again, I think that's just a small saying that I'm basically saying is that keep an open mind, keep an open perspective, and also listen up very closely on what's happening in the world.
Today's podcast was really inspiring and gave us so many insights from Mas Putra Adhiguna. Alright then, once again, thank you Mas Putra for your time and your willingness to share your knowledge and giving us a really helpful sharing session for today. I hope you all the best for your work. And I also want to thank our listeners, SPE people, for watching this podcast. Thank you and see you in our next event. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.